The woman in the red-soled heels never stepped inside the cathedral. She did not need to. From where she sat in the black town car beneath the stone portico, she had a clear view of the front steps, the stained glass doors, and the exact moment Naomi Carter Wells was told to move. Inside, the cathedral smelled of lilies, candle wax, and old money trying to look like grief. Ushers in dark suits moved quietly between rows of polished pews. The organ played low and sorrowful, and the city's most respected names filled the sanctuary in tailored black, pearls, and expressions arranged carefully enough to suggest loss without disturbing dignity. At the front, beneath the massive white floral display and the framed portrait of the deceased, sat Naomi. She wore a simple black dress, no diamonds, no designer label visible from the aisle, no armor except composure. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, one thumb pressed against the inside of her other wrist, where her pulse had been racing for the last 20 minutes. Above the casket, the portrait looked down with a face the papers had called legendary for decades. Victor Langston, founder of Langston Infrastructure Group, billionaire industrialist, political donor, philanthropist. A man who had spent 40 years building ports, rail systems, and logistics corridors across America. A man the financial world admired, the media dissected, and the public never really knew. A man Naomi had spent her whole life almost knowing. She had not expected to be seated in the front row. An older woman from the cathedral staff had met her at the entrance and guided her there personally, saying only, "You were expected." Expected. The word had been turning over inside Naomi ever since. She had almost asked for an explanation, almost said there must be some mistake. But then she had seen the portrait, and whatever question had been forming dissolved into something heavier and stranger. Victor Langston had her eyes. Not exactly. Age altered faces, wealth sharpened them, power hardened them. But still, those gray-blue eyes, serious and watchful, and somehow private even in a painted expression meant for public remembrance, were hers in a way that made her chest tighten. She stared at the portrait too long. That was when her husband leaned toward her. Ethan Wells did not touch her first. He looked around. That was the kind of man he was. Before emotion, he took inventory. He noticed the trustees seated nearby. He noticed the men from investment firms he had spent years trying to impress. He noticed the brass placard marking the row for family and executive leadership. He noticed Naomi sitting there as though she belonged. Then he bent close and whispered, "Why are you up here?" Naomi turned to him slowly. Her thoughts were too tangled for defensiveness. "They seated me here." Ethan's jaw shifted. It was a small movement, but Naomi knew it well. It was the look he got when reality stopped obeying the version of it that suited him. His mother, Bernice Wells, arrived one hymn later. Bernice had mastered the art of elegant cruelty so completely that most people confused it for refinement. She moved like a woman who considered every room a stage prepared in advance for her entrance. Black silk, diamond studs, gloved hands, chin lifted precisely high enough to imply standards. When she saw Naomi in the front pew, her expression did not change much. It didn't need to. She stepped in close, leaned down just enough to be heard without making a scene, and said, "Naomi, sweetheart, this seating is for the Langston family." The words were soft. The humiliation was not. Naomi looked up at her, confused more than angry. Bernice's smile thinned. "You need to stand up." A few people in the row behind them had already started paying attention. Naomi could feel it without turning around. Wealthy people were often too disciplined to stare openly, but they always noticed disorder in spaces built for hierarchy. Ethan exhaled quietly, irritated that the moment had not resolved itself without effort. "Don't argue," he murmured. "Just go to the back. Please don't do this here. Do this." As if she had manufactured the front pew. As if she had orchestrated the portrait, the casket, the strange pull in her chest. As if grief itself were another one of her inconvenient emotions arriving in the wrong room. Naomi swallowed. In the outer pocket of her coat, folded carefully and still unopened, was the envelope the estate attorney had slipped into her hand at the cathedral entrance. "Mr. Langston asked that this be given to you before the service begins." That was what he had said. She had not opened it. She had told herself she would read it later, when her hands stopped shaking, when the music ended, when whatever ache had been building inside her finally took shape. Now, Bernice placed 2 fingers lightly against Naomi's arm, as if guiding a child out of a formal dinner. "This is not the place for confusion." Ethan added, lower now, less patient. "You don't know these people." Naomi felt something inside her go very quiet. Not strong, not triumphant, just quiet. She stood up. The organ continued. The congregation remained seated. No one interrupted the service. But a silence still formed around her. The kind of silence people make when they do not want to be involved in someone else's shame, but they do want to remember it later. Naomi stepped out of the pew. She walked past the polished casket, past the flowers, past the portrait with her eyes, past the first rows of old money and public grief. She did not hurry. That was the only dignity left available to her in the moment, and she held on to it with both hands. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. At the curb, beneath the cathedral awning, the black town car idled softly. Through the tinted rear window, a woman watched her descend the steps. Camille Hart. The woman Ethan said was just part of the development team. The woman whose perfume had shown up on his jacket twice last month. The woman whose name Naomi had once seen, glowing across his phone at 11:43 p.m., before he turned the screen over too quickly and asked why she was still awake. Camille's face remained mostly hidden behind the glass, but Naomi still caught the smile. Small, private, satisfied. The smile of a woman who believed the story was going exactly as planned. Naomi walked past the car without reacting. She reached her own sedan, got inside, locked the doors, and let both hands fall to the steering wheel. Then she sat there, breathing. One breath, then another, then another. It would have been easier, perhaps, if Victor Langston had been a complete stranger. But he wasn't. To understand Naomi, you have to go back to a small blue house on the edge of Charleston, South Carolina, where the porch paint peeled in summer heat, and her mother kept basil in clay pots because she said a house should smell like something alive. Her mother, Elena Carter, raised her on 2 principles and 1 secret. The principles were simple. Never beg to be respected, and never become cruel just because cruelty found you first. The secret was harder. Naomi's father existed in the house only as absence with expensive handwriting. Every birthday, a card arrived in a cream envelope, always mailed from a different city, always signed only with a V. At 10, Naomi asked if V meant Victor. Her mother, standing at the kitchen sink in late afternoon light, had gone still for a long moment before saying, "It means someone who loved badly, but not falsely." That was all. No photographs on the mantel, no dramatic confessions, just fragments. A scholarship application that mysteriously received private sponsorship her senior year of high school. A medical bill for Elena's surgery that disappeared before the final notice. A silver locket given to Naomi on her 16th birthday, placed in her hand by her mother with the words, "He asked me to give you this when you were old enough not to mistake money for character." Inside the locket was a tiny folded note in a man's disciplined handwriting. "For the day you ask where you came from." Naomi had kept that locket her entire life, though she stopped opening it after college. Some questions become more painful, not less, when they remain unanswered too long. Elena was not bitter. That made it harder. Bitter women are easy for the world to dismiss. They are called angry, dramatic, unreasonable, wounded past usefulness. But Naomi's mother had never been any of those things. She was thoughtful, self-contained, and deeply loving in a way that made every silence feel chosen rather than empty. When Naomi was 24 and Elena was dying, she finally asked, "Was he my father?" Her mother was already weak by then, her voice thinned by illness, her once steady hands turned fragile against the hospital blanket. "Yes," she said. Naomi had closed her eyes. "Why didn't he come?" Elena looked at the window. "Because I asked him not to." Naomi turned back sharply. "Why?" A sadness Naomi would only fully understand years later moved across her mother's face. "Because men like Victor Langston do not arrive alone. They bring lawyers, relatives, journalists, expectations, enemies, legacy, control. They bring rooms that make you smaller if you are not built for them." She took Naomi's hand. "I wanted you to grow up loved before you were ever observed." Naomi cried then, not from anger, but from the unbearable complexity of being protected by an absence. Elena pressed the locket into her palm. "He watched from a distance," she whispered. "That does not excuse everything, but it is not the same as not loving you." 3 weeks later, Elena was gone. Naomi met Ethan Wells 18 months after that. Grief makes some people wise and others reachable. Naomi, in those years, was reachable. Ethan was charming in the polished, attentive way of men who know how to make emotional women feel chosen. He sent flowers to her office. He remembered details. He looked at her as if her quietness were depth rather than caution. At restaurants, he leaned forward when she spoke. He made her feel not just seen, but selected. After a childhood built partly around somebody's distance, selection can feel a lot like safety. She married him. For the first 2 years, it almost felt like the right decision. Then the corrections began. Not obvious ones, small ones. "Don't wear that. It reads too modest. You're being too sensitive about my mother. Why do you always make ordinary things emotional? You're lucky I understand you. Camille is just a colleague. You embarrass yourself when you act insecure." And because Naomi had been raised by a dignified woman, because loyalty had been modeled to her as strength, because patience can sometimes disguise itself as virtue while quietly becoming self-erasure, she adapted. She spoke less, apologized more, made herself easier to manage. Bernice disapproved of her with the consistency of religion. Camille arrived at the edges of Ethan's life with the patience of strategy. And Ethan, who liked to think of himself as a good man because he was rarely cruel loudly, simply allowed Naomi to become smaller inside the marriage until even her pain learned to lower its voice. That was the woman they pushed out of the cathedral. At 1:17 in the morning, alone in her kitchen, Naomi opened the envelope. There were 4 documents inside. The first was a letter from Victor Langston, 7 pages, handwritten. She had to stop twice in the first paragraph because her eyes blurred too badly to read. My dearest Naomi, if this has reached you, then I have failed at the one thing I hoped I might still do in person. I wanted to tell you myself. I wanted, absurdly perhaps, to earn the right to look at you and say the words after too many years of not saying enough. He wrote of Elena, of a love that began before his company went public, before board wars and inheritance battles and political scrutiny hardened every personal choice into strategy. He wrote that Elena had refused his money for herself, but accepted only what might quietly protect Naomi's future. He wrote that she had asked for distance and privacy, not because she doubted his love, but because she understood the machinery around men like him better than he had at the time. He had honored her decision badly, he admitted, with longing, with resentment toward himself, with birthday cards too small for what he meant and too late to change what had been lost. The scholarship had been him. The hospital bills had been him. The apartment deposit when Naomi moved to Chicago after graduate school had been him, routed through a trust assistant who never knew her name. I do not ask forgiveness, he wrote. I ask only that you know absence and indifference are not the same sin. Naomi pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth and kept reading. The second document was legal acknowledgement of paternity. The third was the amended estate filing. The fourth was a sealed instruction from Langston and Price Holdings. Victor Langston had left Naomi majority control of Langston Infrastructure Group, the private family office, and the Langston Foundation endowment. Total estimated value, $22.6 billion. Naomi did not move for a long time. She sat at that kitchen table while the refrigerator hummed softly, and the city outside her window slept without knowing anything had changed. But what overwhelmed her was not the number. It was the line near the end of the letter. I knew there would come a day when the world would measure your worth by what I left you. I need you to remember, before that day arrives, that your worth was complete long before anyone knew your name beside mine. At 7:10 a.m., Ethan came downstairs in running clothes, checked his phone, grabbed his keys, and only then noticed Naomi still sitting at the table. He frowned. You stayed up all night? Naomi looked at him. There are moments in life when someone's face becomes newly visible, not because they have changed, but because you finally stop viewing them through your hope. Yes, she said. He glanced at the papers. Are you going to explain this? She almost smiled at that. Explain this. As if explanation were still something she owed him before respect. Instead, she folded the documents carefully back into the envelope. No, she said. I'm going to proceed. 2 months later, the Langston Foundation Renewal Gala was held at the Halcyon Hotel Ballroom in Manhattan. It was the event of the season for everyone who confused philanthropy with reputation management and power with invitation lists. Governors, investors, nonprofit chairs, media executives, family offices, board members. They all came dressed in restraint expensive enough to count as spectacle. Ethan came with Camille on his arm. He had not yet fully understood what was happening, even after the divorce papers, even after his firm's unanswered calls to Langston corporate offices, even after Bernice insisted there must have been some misunderstanding at the cathedral, some administrative absurdity that would be corrected once everyone calmed down. Ambitious men are often the last to believe a closed door is truly closed. He still thought, somewhere inside himself, that proximity might save him. Bernice was already seated near the stage, scanning the room with the brittle optimism of a woman rehearsing a future apology she hoped she would never need to give. At 8:41, the room shifted. Conversations thinned. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Attention moved, not dramatically, but decisively, toward the side entrance. The host stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "tonight marks the first public address of the new chair of the Langston Foundation and majority steward of Langston Infrastructure Group. Please welcome Ms. Naomi Carter Langston." She entered in deep silver. No diamonds, no theatrical train, no revenge dress. Just a gown cut with precision, quiet enough to suggest confidence, elegant enough to command the room without pleading for it. At her throat hung Elena's silver locket. Jonathan Price, Victor's longtime counsel, walked behind her. The applause started before she reached the stage. Then it rose. Then the entire ballroom stood, except Ethan. He remained seated for 1 second too long, the exact second in which a man feels the ground beneath his life separate into before and after. Camille's smile disappeared entirely. Bernice turned slowly in her chair and stared with the horrified stillness of someone seeing, at last, the full cost of her own certainty. Naomi reached the podium. When she spoke, her voice was calm, low, and exact. "My father believed the most useful thing wealth can do is restore dignity where systems have failed to do so. Under this foundation's next chapter, we will expand healthcare access in underserved southern counties, create scholarship pathways for daughters of single mothers, and fund legal support for women rebuilding after financial and emotional coercion." No flourish. No glance toward Ethan. No public anger. That was what made the moment devastating. She was not there to punish them. She was there to continue a legacy they had been too arrogant to imagine included her. After the speech, Ethan crossed the ballroom. He moved quickly but not confidently, more like a man chasing the final seconds before a door seals permanently. "Naomi." She turned. He stopped in front of her, his face pale with the effort of holding on to composure. "You knew?" he asked. Naomi looked at him for a moment. "I learned after the cathedral." His mouth opened, closed. "You should have told me." For years, those words would have worked. They would have triggered guilt, explanation, emotional labor. They would have pulled Naomi back into the old shape. Not now. "You told me I didn't belong in the front row at my father's funeral," she said quietly. People nearby fell silent. Ethan swallowed. "Naomi, I didn't know." "No," she said. "You didn't bother to." Bernice had reached them by then. Camille, too, though she stayed half a step back, already measuring the atmosphere like a strategist evaluating loss. Naomi's gaze shifted to Bernice. "You said the row was for family." Bernice tried to smile. It trembled at the edges. "Darling, if I had understood—" "You understood enough to humiliate me publicly," Naomi said. Still not loud, still not cruel, just true. Jonathan Price stepped forward with a slim black portfolio. "Mr. Wells," he said pleasantly, "Langston Infrastructure has finalized its review of external counsel for the East Harbor Transit bid." Ethan turned. Jonathan handed him a sealed letter. "We've selected different representation." That was it. No speech, no malice, no spectacle, just a decision. But everyone around them understood what it meant. The deal Ethan had spent a year pursuing was gone. Not because Naomi had screamed, plotted, or performed revenge, simply because she now occupied the position from which decisions were made, and she no longer entrusted her future to a man who had helped remove her from her own father's funeral. Camille stepped back first. Bernice said nothing. Ethan looked at Naomi as if trying to find the version of her who would still absorb his confusion and call it love. He did not find her. Naomi held his gaze one final moment and said, "You were never punished by my success, Ethan. You were undone by how little you valued me before it." Then she turned and walked away. The consequences arrived gradually, which is how real consequences often arrive. Ethan's firm lost the East Harbor bid within the week. 2 related accounts followed. Rumors spread through the city's legal and development circles. Not loud rumors, just the quiet kind successful people pass to one another over cocktails when deciding who is safe to keep near opportunity. Bernice attempted repair. She called old friends, board wives, church donors, and anyone else still willing to listen. She reframed, revised, softened, recast the cathedral incident as a misunderstanding, a stressful day, an unfortunate confusion. But memory is stubborn when humiliation was public. The invitations thinned, then stopped. Camille disappeared with the efficiency of a woman who had always mistaken access for attachment. She took a position in San Francisco 3 weeks later and was photographed beside a venture capitalist with better timing than Ethan and more capital at risk. Naomi did not watch any of it closely. That was the difference. People assumed her silence meant triumph too deep for words. It wasn't triumph. It was release. She bought back her mother's house in Charleston, restored the porch, replanted the basil, put Elena's sewing chair by the window where afternoon light still fell in a soft gold square. In the study of her new Manhattan office, she kept exactly 2 framed photographs: Elena laughing with wind in her hair, and Victor standing alone on a dock at dusk, looking not powerful, but tired in a way she recognized. She forgave him slowly. Not for the distance itself, for being human inside a world that had trained humanity out of him too early. And one Sunday in early autumn, Naomi sat on her mother's porch with the locket warm against her skin and understood something that money had not taught her, power had not taught her, and pain had taken years to say clearly. A person's value does not begin when a room finally recognizes it. Recognition is late. Worth is earlier. Worth was there when she was a girl, opening birthday cards with no return address. Worth was there when Elena stretched not enough into enough. Worth was there in the cathedral when they asked her to move. Worth was there before the inheritance, before the headlines, before the standing ovation. The money did not create her importance. It exposed their blindness. And maybe that is the saddest thing about people who worship status. They cannot see dignity until dignity arrives, carrying proof they personally respect. But Naomi no longer needed to be seen by the people who once mishandled her. She had inherited more than a company. She had inherited clarity. If there is a lesson in her story, it is not that hidden wealth saves the wounded. It is that some women are dismissed not because they are small, but because the people around them are only capable of measuring what can be publicly priced. Naomi had been valuable when they were ashamed of her, valuable when they ignored her, valuable when they underestimated her, and valuable when the ballroom finally rose to its feet. She did not become more because they saw her. She simply stopped shrinking for those who never intended to. And sometimes, that is the moment a woman truly arrives.